In 1913, an archaeologist named William Matthew Flinders Petrie cracked open a tomb at Tarkhan in Egypt and found almost nothing. 5 alabaster jars. 2 wooden tool handles. A small pot lid. And a pile of dirty linen that nobody thought twice about. The pile went into storage. It sat in a museum collection for 64 years. Then in 1977, a conservator unfolding the fabric realized what she was looking at. Not a shroud. Not a wrapping. A dress. With pleated shoulders. With finished seams. With deliberate shaping. The Tarkhan dress. Dated in 2015 to approximately 5,500 years old, the oldest piece of clothing ever recovered from the archaeological record. The most important garment in human history sat in a museum storage box for 6 decades before anyone noticed. But the Tarkhan dress is not the beginning of the clothing story. It is simply the oldest complete garment we have found. And ancient clothing is extraordinarily difficult to find because organic material, hide, fiber, thread, almost always disappears. It takes very specific conditions, like the bone-dry air of an Egyptian tomb, to preserve something as fragile as fabric across thousands of years. So we know the clothing record we have is incomplete. The real question is how incomplete. And the answer to that question leads to a series of discoveries that keep pushing the date of our first garment further and further back than ancient Egypt, further back than the first city, further back than farming itself. Excavations at Çatalhöyük in Turkey, one of the earliest known human settlements, approximately 9,000 years old, recovered textile fragments from burial contexts in 1964 and 2008. Originally identified as wool, they were reanalyzed in the 1980s and again in 2017, with the final conclusion that the fibers were bast fibers, harvested from tree bark. These fragments are approximately 8,500 years old. 3,000 years older than the Tarkhan dress. And they are not the beginning either. The textile fragments at Çatalhöyük are already the end product of a process, spinning, weaving, finishing, that required significant prior knowledge and specialized tools. They did not appear from nowhere. They are the visible tip of a longer invisible story. And the next layer of that story is found in a cave in the country of Georgia, 30,000 years ago, where someone was making deliberately dyed colored thread. Pink. Turquoise. Black. Gray. 30,000 years ago. The Dzudzwana cave in Georgia contains hundreds of flax fiber fragments dated to approximately 30,000 years ago. Some of the fibers are spun. At least one has several knots, evidence of intentional manipulation for cord or thread production. And some of them are dyed. Not accidentally discolored. Deliberately dyed. Researchers identified black fibers, gray fibers, turquoise fibers, and one pink fiber, produced from plant or mineral sources that required specific knowledge to locate and use. 30,000 years ago, someone in the mountains of Georgia was making colored thread. Not because they were cold. Because the color meant something. This is the point at which the clothing story stops being purely about survival and starts being about something else, something that the body louse evidence will eventually confirm. Clothing was not just a response to cold. It was a response to being human. To having an identity. To belonging to a group that expressed itself through what covered the body. But before identity came survival. And the most direct evidence for the act of making survival clothing, the act of piercing hide to join pieces together, comes from even further back. Deep in the Sabutu cave in South Africa, archaeologists found bone tools including a needle so fine that its tip was interpreted as being designed specifically to pierce animal hide delicately, without tearing it. The Sabutu cave needle is approximately 61,000 years old. This is not a flax fiber. Not a woven textile. It is a tool. A purpose-built instrument for joining pieces of hide together. And a needle that fine serves one function, sewing. At 61,000 years ago, someone was sewing clothing together with a bone needle. We know this because we have the needle. And because a needle that fine has no other use. The bone needle from Cebudu was made from animal bone, shaped by scraping with a small sharp flint tool, the tip refined to approximately 1 mm in diameter. The hole at the blunt end allowed sinew thread to be pulled through the hide as the needle was pushed. The stitches would have been small, precise, and strong. This was not a beginner's tool. This was the product of a craft that had already been practiced long enough to produce a specialist instrument. And at 61,000 years ago, it is still not the earliest evidence for clothing. Before needles. Before thread. Before any tool evidence for clothing manufacture. There was the simplest garment form, an animal skin, scraped clean of tissue, dried, and draped over the body. Not sewn. Not shaped. Simply a hide used as a covering, what archaeologists and ethnographers describe as a cape-style garment, held against the body by its own weight or fastened loosely with a strip of the same hide. This is the form of clothing that required the least technological development. The most ancient. And evidence for it, not the garment itself, which cannot survive, comes from the tools used to process the hide. Stone scrapers. Specifically, the Levallois-style flint scraper, a prepared core flake tool designed to produce a wide, consistent scraping edge. Stone scrapers have been found at Neanderthal sites across Europe dating to between 60,000 and 130,000 years ago, with use-wear analysis showing the specific polish and microchipping pattern that develops on a tool edge used repeatedly against animal hide. Neanderthals were scraping animal hides. And the only significant use of a scraped and cleaned animal hide, in an Ice Age European environment, was wearing it. This matters beyond the technical. The question of whether Neanderthals wore clothing has been directly tied to one of the hypotheses for their eventual extinction, that Homo sapiens developed more sophisticated cold-weather clothing while Neanderthals did not, and that this difference contributed to the outcome of the contact between the two groups when modern humans arrived in Europe approximately 45,000 years ago. The evidence suggests this picture is too simple. Neanderthals were processing hides. But the animal species found at Neanderthal sites and Homo sapiens sites show a difference. Wolves, foxes, and hares, animals selected specifically for their dense thermal winter fur, are present at both types of site, but found more frequently at Homo sapiens sites. The interpretation: both groups used animal skins. But Homo sapiens were more systematically incorporating warm fur-bearing animal hides into their clothing, for lining, for edging, in a way that gave a measurable thermal advantage in the coldest European winters. The difference may not have been whether to wear clothing. The difference may have been how well the clothing worked. There is a moment in the Dzudzwana cave, 30,000 years ago, that is difficult to think about for long. 3 people sitting beside a fire in an Ice Age cave, their bodies covered in animal hide garments that took significant time and specific knowledge to produce, one of them wearing a strip of deliberately dyed turquoise thread incorporated into the shoulder piece of the garment. The clothing is not keeping them warmer than a simpler drape would. The color is not a survival adaptation. The color is there because the person who made it chose it. Because the person who wore it wanted it visible. Because the garment had stopped being purely about the body's temperature and started being about the person's identity. This happened 30,000 years ago in a limestone cave in what is now the country of Georgia. The oldest documented use of color in clothing in the human record. And yet even the Dzudzwana fiber evidence is not the earliest date we have for clothing. The earliest date comes from the most unlikely source, parasitology. The study of parasites that live on and in human bodies. Specifically, lice. There are 2 subspecies of human lice. The head louse, Pediculus humanus capitis, which lives on the scalp. And the body louse, Pediculus humanus, which does not live on the body. It lives on clothing. It moves to the body only to feed, then retreats to the seams of garments. The body louse requires clothing to exist. It cannot survive without it. Scientists extracted DNA from both head lice and body lice and sequenced segments to determine when the 2 subspecies diverged. The divergence point represents the moment when the ecological niche of clothing, warm, close to the skin, consistent, became available for lice to colonize. The result, body lice diverged from head lice at least 83,000 years ago. Possibly as long as 170,000 years ago. Our own parasites have given us the oldest date we have for consistent clothing use in Homo sapiens. The answer was in the linen. It was in the bone needle. It was in the dyed fiber. And it was on our bodies the entire time, waiting in the seams of our oldest garments. The Tarkhan dress is 5,500 years old. The Catalhoyuk textile fragments are 8,500 years old. The Dzudzwana fibers are 30,000 years old. The Sabuda needle is 61,000 years old. The body louse divergence is 83,000 years old at minimum. Each discovery pushing the date back further. Each one a different kind of evidence, garment, textile, fiber, tool, parasite, each one arriving at the same conclusion from a different direction. Here is what the color tells us. 30,000 years ago someone took the time to dye a fiber turquoise. To find the plant or mineral that produced that specific color, to learn how to apply it, to produce a thread colored in a way that served no survival function. The clothing did not need to be that color. The cold did not require turquoise. The turquoise was there because the person wearing it was not only solving the problem of cold. The person was constructing an identity. Was placing themselves in a social group that used color to mark membership, status, meaning. The turquoise thread at Dzudzwana is not just evidence of clothing. It is evidence of the moment when covering the body became part of expressing the self. Catalhoyuk at 9,000 years ago shows the next stage, a city where people had sufficient surplus time and social complexity to develop textile specialization, the weaving of bast fibers into fabric as a practiced craft rather than a survival necessity. And at Tarkhan, 5,500 years ago, the Tarkhan dress, with its pleated shoulders and finished seams and consistent thread count, is the product of a specialist craftsperson who understood the garment as an object of quality. Not just coverage. Quality. The dress is beautifully made. Whoever wore it was meant to look dressed. From the rough animal hide drape of a Homo sapiens group 83,000 years ago, the clothing that created the ecological niche for the body louse, to the pleated linen dress in the Egyptian tomb, the same fundamental act, separated by 77,500 years of accumulated knowledge, specialization, and the specifically human insistence on not only solving practical problems but making the solutions beautiful. The Tarkhan dress sat in a museum storage box for 64 years before anyone recognized what it was. The most important garment in the world, unrecognized, in a pile of dirty linen from a tomb that Petrie considered nearly empty. The answer to when we first stopped being naked is not in a single date. It is in the series of things that survived long enough to be found, the pleated linen, the woven bast fiber, the colored thread, the bone needle, and the parasite whose DNA carries the oldest timestamp of all. We have been covering our bodies for at least 83,000 years. And every single piece of evidence we have found for that fact was accidental, preserved by circumstance, recognized by patience, waiting in a storage box or a cave or a seam for someone to look closely enough to understand what was there.